The night they left the tent. Based on documented events, Dyatlov Pass incident. In early 1959, a group of 9 experienced hikers set out into the northern Ural Mountains. They were young, trained, and familiar with extreme winter conditions. This wasn't an unusual trip for them. It was the kind of expedition they had done before, carefully planned, documented, and taken seriously. Their route led them toward a remote mountain known as Kolatsiakl, a name often translated as Mountain of the Dead. At the time, it was just another destination. For most of the journey, everything appeared normal. The group kept journals, took photographs, and followed a steady pace through difficult terrain. The weather was harsh but manageable. There were no signs of panic or conflict. Then, on the night of February 1st, something changed. The group set up camp on an exposed slope rather than moving into the forest below, where there would have been more shelter. It wasn't an ideal location, but it wasn't unthinkable either. Experienced hikers sometimes make decisions like that based on visibility and terrain. Sometime during that night, they left the tent. What makes that detail so important is how they left. The tent was later found partially collapsed, with several cuts made from the inside. Instead of using the entrance, they had opened their way out through the fabric itself. That suggests urgency, not confusion, not routine. Something that made staying inside feel unsafe. They didn't take what they needed to survive. Boots were left behind. Heavy clothing was left behind. Supplies remained inside the tent. And yet, they stepped out into temperatures well below freezing. The tracks they left in the snow were visible for some distance. They didn't show signs of running or chaos. The group appeared to move together, descending the slope toward a nearby forest. It wasn't a scattered escape. It looked controlled. The first bodies were discovered near a large cedar tree at the edge of that forest. They were lightly dressed and barefoot. There were signs they had tried to start a fire. Above them, branches were broken high up the tree, suggesting that someone had climbed it, possibly to get a better view of something in the distance. Further along the path, more bodies were found between the tree and the tent. Their positions suggested they had attempted to return, but didn't make it. At that point, the assumption was exposure. The cold alone would have been enough. But the remaining discoveries complicated that explanation. Months later, when the snow began to melt, the final bodies were found in a ravine deeper in the forest. Some of them had suffered severe internal injuries, fractured skulls, crushed ribs. Yet there were no corresponding external wounds. The kind of force required to cause that damage is usually associated with high-impact events, not something that happens during a retreat on foot. There were other details that didn't fit neatly. Some clothing showed traces of radiation. One victim was missing soft tissue, including part of the tongue. While some of this could be explained by environmental factors, not all of it was easily accounted for. Over time, multiple theories were proposed. An avalanche, military testing, natural phenomena that could trigger panic or disorientation. Each explanation addressed part of the evidence, but none covered everything. What remains consistent is the behavior of the group. 9 experienced individuals made the same decision at the same time, to leave their shelter without proper equipment and move into conditions they understood well enough to fear. Whatever happened that night didn't just force them out of the tent. It convinced them that staying inside was the greater risk. The night the house stayed quiet. Based on documented events. Villisca Axe Murders. In June of 1912, in the small town of Villisca, something happened inside a quiet house on a quiet street. And for hours, no one noticed. The Moore family had spent the evening at church. It was a normal Sunday, nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Later that night, they returned home. With them were two young guests, friends who had been invited to stay over. By all accounts, everything was calm. The house went dark, doors closed. The town settled into silence. Sometime after midnight, someone entered the house. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no obvious struggle at the door, just entry. What followed happened quietly. Room by room, one after another, everyone inside the house was killed. The weapon used was an axe found inside the home. And what makes this case especially unsettling is not just what happened, but how long it went unnoticed. The next morning, neighbors began to feel something wasn't right. The house was still, too still. Eventually, someone went inside, and that's when everything changed. Inside, the scene didn't suggest chaos. It suggested control. The victims were found in their beds, some still covered, as if someone had taken the time to move through the house carefully. There were details that didn't quite make sense. Curtains drawn, mirrors covered, objects placed in ways that felt deliberate. It didn't feel rushed. It didn't feel random. It felt like someone had been there, longer than necessary. Investigators searched the house. They questioned neighbors. They followed leads. And at first, there were suspects. Several names surfaced over time. People were questioned. Some were even brought to trial. But none of it led to a confirmed answer. No one was ever definitively identified. And that's where the case begins to shift. Because what remains isn't just the crime. It's the absence of explanation. A house in the middle of a quiet town where something happened overnight without anyone hearing or seeing or stopping it. Years passed, then decades. The house still stands. People visit it. They walk through the same rooms, stand in the same spaces, trying to understand what it must have felt like that night. But there's no clear answer, no final explanation. Because whatever entered that house didn't just leave quietly. It left nothing behind that could explain why it was ever there. The Ranch Where Nothing Stays Normal, based on reported events, Skinwalker Ranch. Out in northeastern Utah, there's a stretch of land that looks completely ordinary. Open fields, fences, quiet skies. At a glance, there's nothing unusual about it. But for decades, people who've lived there or worked there have described something different. Strange lights in the sky, appearing without sound, then disappearing just as quickly. Animals behaving in ways that don't make sense. Cattle found injured with no clear cause. No tracks, no signs of struggle, just absence. And then there are the reports that are harder to categorize. Figures seen at a distance, sometimes human, sometimes not quite. Always brief, always just far enough away to avoid certainty. One family, who lived on the ranch in the 1990s, documented repeated events. They described large creatures near the property, unusually calm, unusually aware. At times, they said it felt less like being observed and more like being studied. There were also reports of objects appearing, then disappearing. Equipment failing, then working again. Moments where everything felt normal, followed by something that clearly wasn't. Investigators eventually became involved. Not just individuals, but organized groups. The ranch drew attention from researchers connected to National Institute for Discovery Science. They set up monitoring equipment, cameras, sensors, trying to capture something, anything that could be measured. But that turned out to be part of the problem. because the activity didn't behave consistently. When people were present, things would happen. Unexpected, brief, difficult to document. When equipment was left running, there was often nothing, or just enough to raise questions without providing answers. Over time, theories began to form. Some suggested environmental explanations. Others pointed to psychological factors. And then there were ideas that went much further. Portals, unknown entities, something interacting with the space in ways we don't fully understand. But none of those explanations have been confirmed. What remains is a location where multiple types of reports overlap. Not one pattern, not one clear phenomenon, but many. Lights in the sky, unexplained animal deaths, strange figures, moments that feel out of place. And the most unsettling part is not any single event, it's the consistency of the uncertainty. Because people leave the ranch with stories that don't match each other, but all point to the same conclusion. Something is happening there. And whatever it is, it doesn't seem to follow rules or stay visible long enough to be fully understood.